What happens when a nation breaks free from an entrenched economic dependency and boldly charts its own course in the global energy market? For decades, Washington assumed that Canada would hesitate, under pressure expecting lengthy negotiations, slow diplomacy, and perhaps even some concessions. Instead, Canada made a radical choice. It cut a direct path to China, bypassing the United States entirely. For years, the United States maintained a chokehold on Canada's energy exports. Almost every drop of Canadian crude was destined for the U.S. market, leaving Ottawa with just one buyer, one dependency, and one significant risk. That long-established dynamic is now unraveling. New tariffs, rising tensions, and a revolutionary pipeline expansion have dramatically altered the rules of the game. This transformation isn't merely about oil. It's about reclaiming control and rewriting the framework under which Canada operates. For the first time in decades, Canada is making its own rules, and the global energy landscape is taking notice. Historically, Canada's energy resources were funneled almost exclusively into the U.S. market. That singular focus made the nation vulnerable, subject to the whims of its powerful neighbor. The situation began to change when the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came into play, now pumping 890,000 barrels per day directly to the Pacific. This multi-million-dollar project has opened up access to global markets, most notably China. The United States is losing leverage by the day as Canada leverages this newfound access to diversify its energy exports and reduce its dependency on a single market. A pivotal moment came with the imposition of a 10% tariff on Canadian oil, a move that Washington assumed Canada would simply absorb. Instead of shouldering the extra costs, Canada turned its gaze eastward. Why beg the United States to buy Canadian oil when China was eager to secure long-term energy deals? Recognizing an opportunity that had already been exploited by other major energy exporters such as Russia and Saudi Arabia, Canada quickly moved to secure similar long-term partnerships with Beijing. The $24 billion Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion altered the equation overnight. By more than tripling the pipeline's capacity, the project now ensures that Canadian crude can flow directly to key Asian markets, including China, Japan, and Korea. This isn't just about opening up new markets, it's about breaking free from U.S. pricing control. With nearly 50% of China's oil imports arriving through Vancouver's ports, Canada has gained direct access to the world's second-largest economy. While U.S. refiners are now paying extra due to the imposed tariffs, China benefits from buying Canadian crude at a discounted dynamic that turns the situation into a strategic goldmine for Ottawa. The shift offers Canada a dual advantage. On one hand, it secures a reliable and lucrative crude supply that does not require Washington's oversight. On the other, it frees Canada from the heavy discounts that had been the norm when selling oil to a U.S.-dominated market. U.S. refineries, built to process Canadian heavy crude, are now struggling with higher costs while their counterparts in China enjoy lower prices. The U.S. set the tariffs, and now its own refiners are feeling the economic squeeze. Some have even started pushing the White House to lift these tariffs, fearing significant economic losses and potential disruptions in their supply chains. China's role in this unfolding drama goes beyond simply being a willing buyer. Beijing is locking in supply for the long haul. For years, China has been actively diversifying its energy sources, securing long-term contracts with nations such as Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. Now, with Canada joining that list, China is solidifying its strategy of building lasting trade relationships that bypass U.S. influence. Although on the surface it might seem that China is merely capitalizing on Canada's shift, the truth is that Beijing had been preparing for this moment for years. China's extensive investments in its energy infrastructure are now reaping rewards. Billions have been spent on upgrading refineries to handle heavier crude, making them perfectly suited to process Canada's oil sands output. At the same time, major crude pipelines, including the China-Russia Espo pipeline, were expanded to integrate new supply routes. Alongside these pipeline projects, key oil terminals in places like Qingda and Dalian have been modernized to handle increased volumes. This was not an overnight reaction, but the culmination of a long-term strategy that is now paying off handsomely. Where once the United States held Canada in a stranglehold, Canada now has options if Washington decides to tighten restrictions. Ottawa is no longer forced to play along. It has China firmly in its corner. This newfound leverage is reshaping Canada's economic outlook. giving the nation more bargaining power in future trade negotiations. Instead of being confined to selling oil at U.S. dictated prices, Canada now operates on its own terms. The increased revenue from these diversified exports means billions can be reinvested into infrastructure, new pipelines, and energy projects, further strengthening Canada's position on the global stage. For China, securing cheap, reliable oil from a stable supplier represents a perfect deal. The broader implications of Canada's pivot are significant. While it is unlikely that Canada will completely halt exports to the United States in the near future, the diversification of buyers means that Ottawa now holds leverage like never before. In a scenario where tensions escalate, Washington could face a serious energy crisis. The threat of a Canadian oil supply cut might force Washington to rethink its trade strategies and energy policies. However, more oil exports to China also bring challenges: increased tanker traffic, higher emissions, and elevated risks. Coastal communities have begun raising concerns, and environmentalists are sounding alarms to ensure long-term sustainability. For Canada, this means that investments in safety measures, strict regulatory enforcement, and the development of greener energy alternatives have become essential components of this new reality. Washington did not expect Canada to make such a swift and decisive move. For decades, Canadian crude had been a cornerstone of U.S. energy security, but that balance is now shifting. The options available to Washington are increasingly limited. One option is to find a new supplier, but who? Venezuela remains unstable, and under heavy sanctions, Saudi Arabia is politically complicated, and domestic U.S. shale oil, being light rather than heavy, is not a suitable replacement for Canadian crude. The alternative is to pressure Canada into remaining aligned with U.S. interests. Yet Ottawa now has other buyers and no longer waits on Washington's terms. It's tempting to focus solely on the three major players: Canada, the United States, and China, but the ripple effects of this shift extend across the entire global energy market. In Asia, countries like Japan and South Korea are set to benefit from increased supply competition. Both nations, highly dependent on oil imports and equipped with refineries built to process heavy crude, stand to gain access to alternative supplies at more competitive rates as Canada ramps up its exports to Asia. Similarly, India, which has long depended on OPEC nations for its oil supply, now finds an additional supplier in Canada. This diversification reduces India's exposure to the volatile price swings characteristic of the Middle Eastern market. The effects of Canada's new strategy are not limited to national borders. Energy traders, shipping companies, and logistics firms are poised to benefit from the increased volume of crude moving across the Pacific. More Canadian oil in transit means more profits for those handling the shipments, further underscoring the significance of this strategic shift. What began as a Canada-China realignment is now reshaping energy flows across the entire Asia-Pacific region, creating opportunities and challenges on a global scale. Even OPEC is taking notice. China has long relied on millions of barrels of oil per day from OPEC nations such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. With Canadian oil now entering the market, China is less dependent on Middle Eastern supplies. This new reality could force OPEC nations to reconsider their pricing strategies, potentially cutting prices or offering longer-term deals to stay competitive. Meanwhile, Russia is closely watching these developments. Although Moscow has built deep energy ties with Beijing, Canada's growing presence in the market could unsettle that established equation. Clearly, this shift is not just about the interplay between Canada, China, and the United States. It represents a global realignment in the energy sector. Canada's pivot to China is more than a simple trade move. It marks an energy transformation. No longer is Canada merely selling oil, it is building a future where it defines its own economic destiny. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which has tripled capacity to 890,000 barrels per day, now channels Canadian crude directly to Asia. Strategic investments have accelerated the process, allowing energy firms to secure long-term contracts with China that ensure stability in supply. By diversifying its export markets, Canada is cementing its role as a major energy exporter beyond North America. For China, the benefits are equally compelling. The move to secure Canadian oil is not just an economic opportunity, it is a necessity. Beijing has spent years strategically reducing its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. The risks associated with the volatile Middle East, from geopolitical instability to potential supply disruption now. Moreover, the Ma